goodness, so I started streaming it. It's working? Perfect. Okay, cool. I'll close it and I'll open it before the actual debate, okay? Keep it open. Okay, fine. I'll just keep it open then. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye. Sorry?
eventually did make it. Maybe it was just that the Burger King they'd just eaten was like just that good that they couldn't focus on anything else. No, that can't be true. Like McDonald's is way better. On the night out then, after the competition was over, the HIS won both the novice competition and the actual competition, by the way. We went on a really good night out, bringing our trophies with us, naturally, as you do after you win. And as is tradition, we poured a very strange cocktail of beer, wine, and spirits into the novice trophy, and then forced the winners, Meg and Lauren, to drink from it. Just to remind them that, although we do love them for winning, we don't really love them that much. The other trophy was stolen and hidden from us by none other than our brothers in arms downstairs. I say stolen and hidden. Really, Conan just placed it on top of the hand dryer in the men's bathroom. We may have lost the trophy, but at least we still won the final. Nothing else of note really happened on the night out. I mean, it wasn't Cork, so I wasn't expecting much anyway. In fact, Dee was so bored that she fell asleep in the club and subsequently got kicked out by a security guard. It took over an hour and some serious stealthing. She even had her headphones in to listen to the James Bond theme tune before she eventually managed to get back in. At which point, she ran into the exact same security guard that had just kicked her out. Decided the best course of action was to yell at him. I got back in. You can't kick me out again. Na 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 na. Also, private property doesn't exist. Somehow that worked. There being no further business, the meeting adjourned.
Are there any objections to me signing these minutes as a true and accurate account of the last public business meeting? There being none, I shall duly sign.
Hi everyone, welcome to this evening's debate, which is this House believes that the EU will benefit from a Brexit. It is in collaboration with the Student Economic Review, as it's a Student Economic Review debate, with Trinity versus Cambridge. As you can see, it is a competitive debate. Judging this evening, we have Chief Adjudicator Francis Rural, a former Director of ERSI. We have Gary Luck, Financial Risk Manager and graduate of Cambridge. We have Kieran Parkin, Tax Policy Advisor for the Department of Finance. We have Ursula McMill, Parliamentary Assistant at the Shannon Aaron and a former holder of the HIS for the 242nd session, and William Donnelly Scholar, graduate of Trinity in Economics and Philosophy, Treasurer of the 244th session. We also have other teams from Trinity and Cambridge, which welcome to both teams this evening. Tonight, if you've been at case debates before, the rules are slightly different. Speeches are 9 minutes in length. The first minute is still protected as the last minute, but points of information can only be given by teams. We normally take them from the audience not this evening. We also have four speeches at the end, so these will be 4 minutes in length, also with protected time from the beginning, the last one at the end. You have your normal oratory returns up here, so please feel free to fill them out. And I'm going to hand over to the chair, and you can answer the
Thank you very much. Thank you, Overshare, for that. The question before the House this evening is that this House believes the EU will benefit from a Brexit. Trinity are proposing the motion, Cambridge are opposing the motion, and I would now like to call on Sophie Donnelly, representing Trinity, to propose the motion to the House.
Ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen of the Student Economic Review, ladies and gentlemen and honourable adjudicators, Britain is unhappy. Britain is unhappy, ladies and gentlemen, because it has realised that splendid isolation is not so splendid. The question before the House is whether we, operating as the EU, would be better off allowing Britain to aggressively and self-interestedly renegotiate its membership terms, extracting damaging concessions from the EU community, or allow them to leave and leverage our superior economic power over a newly weakened and isolated UK. We, on side proposition, ladies and gentlemen, will be arguing for the latter option. In my speech, I'm going to be presenting the most likely and plausible scenario that we, on side proposition, can imagine will arise upon the UK voting to leave the EU. I will present these under economic and political headings, and I'm going to prove that under this plausible scenario, there's nothing bar benefits for the EU community. We think that we can reasonably define the European interests as continued political an economic success for its member states, and sustained progress towards its goals of integration and ever closer union. So firstly, I'm going to set out the model, i.e. the scenario that we envisage happening. So David Cameron has promised an in-out referendum which will be held before the end of 2017. So we argue that Britain leaving the EU by referendum would be good for the EU. We see that referendum is obviously the most likely scenario that we can see unfolding in the next couple of years, certainly within the next decade, and that's the metric that we're going to be operating under. So recent opinion polls indicate a growing willingness of the British people to vote for withdrawal. So the 52% majority in the most recent poll conducted by the ORB just last week. So regardless, we're debating the hypothetical where they do, and so we see that it's plausible to review perhaps 2019 as the earliest date for the Brexit. So what's going to happen in the aftermath of this, ladies and gentlemen? So in the immediate aftermath, we see that Britain is going to pull out as per provisions made in the Treaty of Lisbon. Article 50 in the Treaty of Lisbon, it will notify the European Parliament of intentions to exit. Mechanism will then be put in place. Negotiations as to the particulars of withdrawal and changes in budget management of the EU will start when Britain gives notice. So we acknowledge that this procedure remains something of an unopened Pandora's box. Like, obviously there hasn't been no state that has so far exited the EU. The problem of how the EU should manage relations with the UK after withdrawal is accounted for in Article 50. So it requires any withdrawal agreement to include a framework for future relations with the withdrawing state. So we acknowledge that this isn't going to be an easy process, ladies and gentlemen. We acknowledge that there's going to be many complexities along the road. However, we do not see that these complexities are insurmountable, and we do not see how these complexities, after a while, will eventually be negotiated to the benefit of the EU. So secondly, I'm going to talk about stability. Despite what the opposing team may assert to the contrary, we do not envisage in our characterisation of unfolding events following a Brexit any descent into political and economic chaos. Why? Because there's no reason why steps wouldn't be taken by the EU, the ECB, the Bank of England, the European Executive and the British Parliament to ensure as smooth and seamless a transition as possible, because it is in the interests of both parties. The EU as a strong trading partner is enormously beneficial for the UK, either in or out of the EU. EU instability is just simply not in the interests of them. A common bloc of 27 member states is obviously going to demand a lot more UK goods than 27 singular markets contending with lots of fluctuating currencies and barriers to the free movement of goods. Therefore, it is always in the UK's interests to have this massive trading bloc to be stable beside it. In the longer term, we see that, like Britain, will be forced to significantly negotiate trade deals across the board. So, on to the first contention on side proposition, which is that if the UK leaves, it needs the EU economy more than the EU economy needs the UK, and thus the EU gets better bargaining leverage. So we believe that it's plausible to characterise the debate in terms of a renegotiated deal between Britain and the EU, which is not overwhelmingly dissimilar to the deal that exists under status quo. Yet in this case, the benefits are tipped massively in favour of the European Union. So we see the EU as massively holding the cards at the negotiating table. Because why? Even with British exit, the EU remains the second largest economic bloc in the entire world, ladies and gentlemen. Free trade continuance between the 27 member states means that the issue of specialised economies doesn't pose much of a difficulty for the EU, so the EU doesn't need Britain's specialisation, while the UK is now challenged to procure elsewhere the goods and services which it cannot now procure through the free trade and the common market. So we see three possible alternatives that may unravel for Britain with regards to membership of the EU and an alternative to that. Firstly, it's the Norwegian model, which Norway adopts pretty much 2/3 of European legislation. It ratifies pretty much everything that the EU passes with just a greater measure of fiscal autonomy. It is basically, ladies and gentlemen, Norway is held in the stranglehold of EU, thus, as a result of their reliance on European trade. If they do not measure up to EU regulations, they will just not get access to that massive export market of the European community. So the threat of being excluded from the single market is always looming for both of these countries. Similarly, in the Swiss model, it similarly has to adapt and ratify most of the EU legislation that is passed. In fact, in Switzerland, it automatically ratifies almost all EU legislation, and it then adopts case-by-case trade deals with the Eurozone. So neither of the above situations are particularly advantageous for the UK. And we could also try and pursue trade interests through the WTO, but like the WTO on its own isn't enough for trade sustainability with the UK, and the WTO still means that the UK is going to have to pay tariffs. So we see ultimately the most plausible scenario unraveling is a special UK tailor-made free trade agreements made on a case-by-case basis with the EU. So, although we concede that the UK will probably have more leverage than its counterparts in Switzerland and Norway by virtue of it just being a larger economy, it's incredibly unlikely that the UK will be able to force the EU's hand and negotiate favourable, sympathetic terms. Why? Well, firstly, the EU in 2014 accounted for 44.6% of UK exports and 53.2% of UK imports of goods and services. So, side opposition may say that the UK might be able to tap into other economies, ladies and gentlemen, but we just see that this is completely delusional. Because, take for example, developing economies. Britain's largest exports are in the tertiary sector. Their largest exports in terms of value are nuclear reactors, luxury cars, aircraft and spacecraft parts, optical, photographic, medical and surgical instruments. None of these items, ladies and gentlemen, are ones for which there's massive markets in developing countries. And they also might point to America as a possible market, yet America's also expressed massive resistance to the idea of the UK leaving the EU and the idea of a bilateral trade deal. They've, for example, the US just simply cannot fill a EU-sized hole in UK terms, even if it wanted to. There's absolutely no US desire to pursue bilateral UK free trade agreements with single states. Therefore, the UK will have to just renegotiate trade deals with the EU, which are likely to be as good for the EU as those that exist in status quo, and are in all likelihoods going to be tipped in favour of the European trading interests. Essentially, the argument is, ladies and gentlemen, the UK cannot leave and afford to be protectionist towards the EU. The UK cannot depend on export markets elsewhere to compensate for loss of trade should the UK adopt protectionist policies towards the EU. Ergo, it needs the EU's trade when it is a non-member, and ergo, the EU has massive leverage over the UK outside the EU. De facto, we are duping the UK into committing to significant proportion of EU regulation and policy without much of the benefits that come with being a fully signed-up member. So the EU is going to therefore be better able to manage the UK as something as a troublesome child as it has leverage. This leverage is therefore going to be used in the following ways. In terms of politics, the UK is consistently defining itself outside of European identities, consistently the antagonistic thorn in the side of the European integration and progression of European policy. And so, we're talking, Cormac's going to further this by talking about the concessions that are being sought by the UK and David Cameron, and how any renegotiation of terms may unleash a destructive force that would weaken wider European unity. Ladies and gentlemen, 28-speed Europe is no Europe at all. Cherry picking is not an option. Europe is not the sum of national interests, but a community with a common fate in difficult times. Ladies and gentlemen, Cormac in his speech will further elaborate on the political and economic aims of the EU and why a Brexit will help and not hinder these aims. Ladies and gentlemen, I have set forward on-side proposition, the most plausible and the most rational situation that is going to unfold in terms of a Brexit. I've shown to you why this is going to be massively in the interests of the EU. Ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to propose.
Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, we believe in a united Europe on this side of the House. We believe in an organisation able to face the challenges of the modern world, one which has the necessary political, economic and military clout to stand up to its international rivals. A divided Europe is a weaker Europe, and this is what we're going to bring to you today. And so the area of discussion I'm going to have in my speech is about the internal scene of the EU post-Brexit. What's it going to look like? Is it actually going to be in the EU's interest? Is it an improvement? And there's going to be sub-points. Primarily, I'm going to talk about general cohesion and structure. I'm going to talk about reform in terms of what the UK has been doing. I'm going to talk about the issue of contagion if we have a Brexit. And then I'm going to talk very briefly on this notion of closer union. Before I get on to that, I want to deal with some of what we've heard from the last speaker. Firstly, we've been told about damaging concessions. Britain cannot be allowed to get its way. It cannot be allowed to bring in these concessions that will destroy the EU. Let's just have a little quick look at what these concessions are. It asks for an opt-out. It asks for states not to be forced to adopt legislation that they don't want to do. We don't see this as inherently wrong. It asks for protection. It asks not to be brought into treaties and not to be brought into legislation that are actively harmful to it. Again, this is not in and of itself a bad thing. It wants reform. It wants reform of legislation that it can prove to be inefficient, legislation that holds back all of the countries in the EU. In its totality, we don't think these reforms are so bad. There is a reason why the German ambassadors are saying that it's workable, that the agreement put forward to Donald Tusk is something that can actually happen and something which doesn't really jeopardise the general structure of the EU. We've heard a lot about a weakened UK, that the EU is somehow going to be so much more powerful than the UK. But we don't really see it this way. We don't see this as an us versus them scenario. In fact, we don't think it's true. We've been told that the EU gets a better deal. Maybe it does. We're not going to really dispute it because it doesn't actually matter. What matters is the EU better off than it is at the moment? Is the EU better off than the status quo? We haven't heard any evidence to suggest that it is. All we've been told is that the UK is worse off. Potentially it will be. That's not a reason for the Brexit to be good for the EU. This isn't about them simply trying to punish the Brits, although that might be somewhat interesting. Okay, we've been told as well about the UK interest, this concept of a trading bloc, that the UK really needs these free trade agreements with the EU, that it can't produce anything else to any other parts of the world because the rest of the world isn't developed. Well, we do think that Australia, most of the somewhat developed nations in the southern hemisphere, as well as the US, are somewhat important. But more important, if we actually look at the trade between Britain and the EU, what we see is a massive trade deficit. What we see is £39 billion being the number. What we see is a situation that the EU is actually in a riskier situation, where it is risking 8 million jobs, which are directly contingent upon trade with the UK. So, to the first point, cohesion and structure of the EU. What is the status quo of the EU at the moment? What we actually see is two blocks within it. We see one block, which is based on free trade. It's led mainly by the UK, but it also includes countries such as Ireland, countries such as Sweden and the Netherlands, and to a lesser extent countries such as Germany. Opposed to this, we have a protectionist bloc. We have something led by France, which doesn't want free trade policies or doesn't want them to anywhere near the same extent. At the status quo, we have a balance because both of them have a blocking minority. Both of them have a veto on legislation. The issue is, if you remove Britain, there is no more veto. The free trade bloc loses out. And what this means is it can no longer prevent legislation which is seriously harmful to it and its citizens. And we think this is quite bad. I'll take you in a second. We think it's bad because it means that some countries are definitely worse off, that many EU nations lose out because a minority of citizens are able to impose their will on the EU to the detriment of anyone else. We think it's bad for growth, bad for jobs, and it results in a lower standard of living for many of these people. Wouldn't you agree?
So if you think a united Europe is a strong Europe, would you agree that Britain has been the source of a lot of the disunity in Europe? Like, see the fact that Cameron wants an explicit concession that there will be no more European integration as one of his 4 concessions.
That's not actually what he wants. What he wants is an opt-out. What he wants is for the UK not to have to be involved. And I'm going to come on later into my speech about why this is actually a good thing for the EU as a whole. So secondly, onto the concept, of countries losing out. What this leads to is destabilisation in the EU. It leads to instability, political and economic division. And what this does is it actually encourages countries to leave. Because what it means is that they are detrimentally worse off as a result of being in the EU. And we think this actually jeopardises the whole EU project. And it feeds into the political division, which creates more countries leaving. Because as more countries leave the free trade bloc, there's an incentive for other countries in the trade bloc to leave. So, onto the continuous positive impact that the UK has actually had on the EU. We think if we look at the UK in the EU, it's actually been quite a driving force for reform. The EU it joined in 1973 was woefully inefficient. If we look at the common agricultural policy, if we look at the common fisheries policy, we see a protectionist notion that is not in the benefits of the EU in the long term, nor is it in the benefits of the short term of the majority of the countries. What we've seen with Britain is a spearheading for reform, an attempt to change this. And we see from 2013 the reforms to the CAP that we see significant progress. As well as this, if we look at the overall regulation of the EU, the red tape that is unnecessary, imposed by the hated Brussels bureaucrats, what we actually get with the EU is with the UK in the EU is some of this being reformed. We've got a commitment with Germany to overview this legislation and to review it and change it that isn't good. As well as this, with the UK actually advocating waste in the EU, that it must be stopped. The fact is, the charade of the Strasbourg Parliament, the sort of switching from Brussels down to Strasbourg, costing the EU on average about €1 billion every budget. Only the UK is actually fighting against this. Only the UK is trying to get this changed. What does this mean? It means in the long term it's actually very beneficial for the EU as a whole. It streamlines the service, it makes it more efficient, it makes it more competitive in the long run. What this means is it's better for business, better for investors, better for employees and entrepreneurs. Overall, it creates jobs, it creates growth. We think this is good for Europe in the long run. We think it's good for this whole entity. As well as this creates opportunities. It raises the standard of living of everyone. It creates a rising tide that floats all boats. As well as this, with regard to the goal of EU unity, it actually helps it because it creates a positive image of the EU. It creates an image of the EU that is changing. And what this means is that it lessens the clout of the Eurosceptics because it sees reform, it gives reform, and it gets rid of most of the harms that the Eurosceptics are talking about. We think this benefits all EU citizens on all levels. What changes when we lose the UK is that we get the clout of France, a protectionist country. We get its soft power and its influence over other nations coming more to the fore. It's very good for their short-term prospects. It's very good for the short term of a minority of countries, but it's not good for the long term. It's not good even for them in the long term, and it's not good for the rest of the EU in the short term. We think reform is important, and we think the fact that we're going to lose a blocking power is very detrimental. We think it's very detrimental particularly for people like Ireland, for people like the Dutch, and for people like the Swedes. We think that there needs to be a powerful voice for reform within the EU, and that we lose this if the UK isn't there. Because the only country that's actually able to step up and take that role is Germany. And it can't do that, because if it does, it is creating huge instability between Germany and France. The basic dynamic breaks down, and the EU ceases to function as well as it must. In terms now of contagion, what actually happens? We've been told that this is a Pandora's box, that no one's actually left the EU before. And we agree, but we think the lesson of the Pandora's box is that you shouldn't open it. What we overall see is a situation that the last speaker described, is that we get a precedent, a mechanism for the Eurosceptics, a means of leaving the EU. We don't see this as positive. We don't see the idea of lessening the EU's clout and lessening its members as a step forward. More importantly, because we lose a reformer, we actually have significant harms to the citizens of the EU. The grievances they have are still in place and are kept in place. No, thank you. We think the letter to Donald Tusk, it gave broadly reasonable demands for reform. These are now going to be seen as unachievable because the one country that has the clout to actually achieve them has been told no and has been driven out of the EU. And we think this is generally bad because it increases the clout of Eurosceptics within their countries. As well as this, we think that Britain is broadly seen as advocating for the rights of smaller countries. It's advocating for the rights of countries, for example, that aren't in the Eurozone. When you lose it, you actually lose the voice of these countries. You are tangibly harming them. We think this is bad as it has the potential to lead to the breakup of the EU. If it doesn't be that extreme, it means that you're at the very least going to lose some countries, which is weakening of the EU generally. And even if none of them leave, we think it divides Europe. It gives it less clout and it gives it less influence on an international stage. So very briefly, I want to address the point raised about ever closer union. We think if ever closer union is really the goal, it's actually undermined by a Brexit. Because we think it's impossible to attempt to have ever closer union if the worst aspects of contagion are actually brought in. If the EU dissolves, if the EU project fails, you cannot have a federal state of Europe. More importantly, even if you have the most moderate form of contagion, even if you just have instability and a rise of Euroscepticism, we think it weakens the ability of other countries to create a federal state of Europe. We think it weakens the ability to actually bring all this together. We've been told a small bit about the blocking power of Britain. Firstly, we think in general its reforms are quite generous. It wants opt-out. It doesn't really want to stop everyone altogether. What it actually wants is for there to be a two-tier EU system. One of states that want federal Europe. One which allows them to come together. It wants, though, to be able to sit on the side and still enjoy trade. We think it's good for democracy. We think this is good for the overall citizens of the EU. We think this is good for all countries. Europe cannot be divided in an increasingly competitive world. It's for these reasons that we are so proud to oppose.
For 800 years, our refrain has been coherent, consistent, and constant. And today, we, as humble representatives of the varied and multiple denizens of this union, take up that mantle and proclaim once again, leave.
Since before its accession, the UK has never quite accepted the warm embrace, the loving embrace of the European community. Just 33 miles of sea separate the UK from the continent, and yet the divisions that exist run deeper and stronger than that proximity would ever suggest. Because the culture in the UK has and will likely continue to be exceptionalism. The continent is the domain of French and German, while the UK belongs only to the Atlantic. Their aim has never been to fully integrate with the EU, to not form a closer union with the rest of Europe, but rather determining to be a party to beneficial economic agreements while being answerable only unto itself. And this action undermines the very foundations of the European project to unite the peoples of a continent and to forge a future of shared identity. This is the basis of my speech. 4 things. Firstly, I'm going to respond to some of the things that we've heard coming out of the first speaker. Secondly, I want to tell you about how integration is impossible with the UK in it. Thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about how the political aims of the EU cannot be achieved without integration. And fourthly, why the economic aims of the EU cannot be achieved without integration. All right, let's get started on responses. So firstly, Britain breeds division within the EU. Now, we're told by the previous speaker that these are things that Britain wants. These are things that it thinks that's beneficial to it. And yeah, more power to the UK. That's fine. We don't begrudge them their self-interest. What we do begrudge them is that their expressed desire to undermine the legitimacy of the EU and undermine the institutions that the EU relies on. Why is this? Because of explicit concessions that it seeks, for example, to lose sovereignty, to not be form a further, closer union with the UK. These are explicit rejections of founding principles of the EU. That's why it breeds division. And then when we turn around and he tells us about reform and how it's a reformist country, if those reforms include the dismissal of human rights and an unwillingness to sign the Charter of Fundamental Human Rights and a desire to change the basis for its human rights law towards the British Bill of Rights away from a unified European policy, then it is absolutely something we do not want in our union. That is absolutely something that is anathema to our desires and our aims. We're also told that it will continue to form free trade alternatives and sign trade deals with other countries, and therefore we would lose ground there. We say that's probably unlikely, given that firstly, the US, as Sophie mentioned, explicitly stated that it is not in the business of forming nation-specific trade agreements in response to a question about the UK leaving. But secondly, when he talks about maybe we're using the global south as a target for further sales. Well, when the largest export from the UK is nuclear reactor parts, and in descending order from there tends to be things like luxury cars, pharmaceuticals, large amounts of electrical and specific optical, surgical and medical equipment, and aircraft and spacecraft, we think that's rather unlikely that they're going to find a target audience in the southern half of the globe, and rather that we will continue to gain the benefits accruing from them. Okay? We're also told that Eurosceptics will be appeased by this. We think Eurosceptics broadly, not exclusively, the main opposition to the EU is not that they don't make reforms, it's that they want more sovereignty to be taken away from nation states. Their chief aim, note the fact that they're called independence parties invariably across Europe, because they don't want specifically sovereignty, and it is specifically a loss of sovereignty from nation states and a giving power to the EU that makes its aims so unique and that makes its aims impossible to do without it, okay? We say small countries won't leave and they won't follow the UK because they won't believe that they have the power to do so. We also say that lots of people are still queuing up to join the EU in the future, so they will join, they will make up for it, we will continue. Yes, go ahead.
When the most conservative estimates put Ireland's GDP shrinking by 1.1% over the next few years, Sweden by a similar margin, and the Netherlands by even greater, how is this actually beneficial for many of the countries in the EU?
Well, I mean, that's obviously what my speech is, and I've given you lots of reasons already, and I will continue to give you reasons why it's good. But quoting a figure at me is nothing, given that lots of conservative estimates have put it even more conservatively than you would suggest. But also, we think economically, in the long run, we have more benefits to bring you. So let's look at at integration and. Sorry, left the page. Oh, here we go. Okay, let's look at integration and how we better achieve integration, right? Because it's already been established that the EU's desire are to form an ever closer union, whether that's through the treaties that we've established, like the Maastricht Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty, whether it's through pledges between countries, whether it's through policy that we've implemented. But further integration has stalled. Why is this? Because there is a justified criticism of the EU that it's undemocratic and that it's specifically in its policy making. Why is this? It's actually because of nations' unwillingness to cede power to the European Parliament, thus giving them a say in policy making. And it results in the European Commission making most of the policy decisions, right? Rendering the European Parliament rather a damn squib. Now it means that people, it's comprised of EC, that most undesirable of humans, not Englishmen, no, but rather of bureaucrats, right? And the UK would like us to picture Jean-Claude Juncker scheming in a presumably German tower somewhere, seeking to take away Union Jacks and British tea, but it's actually as a result of the UK's own unwillingness to give power to the European Parliament that leads them to have power in the first place, right? So the solution is to give power to the European Parliament, and the UK is an obstacle in that aim. Because while you ostensibly give power to the EU and what was seen as a loss, really you actually get real investment and a decision-making power back to nation-states and away from a bureaucratic establishment like the European Commission, okay? We cannot implement that while the UK is there, because the UK is, firstly, their MEPs are majority UKIP. Secondly, there's expressed desires from Cameron to oppose further integration. And finally, because of a long-running history of the UK not wanting to have closer sovereignty ties with the EU and rather trying to remain aloof. So without their constant meddling, we can move forward. We can seek greater integration. Let's look at what that means for political and economic aims. So, political aims. The UK sees the EU solely as an economic domain. That is its first mistake, right? Because there are far more political aims that exist there, and it only wants to be privy to the economic benefits that happen. Why? Because we've seen the EU move from the European Economic Community to an EU that has clearly idealistic and political aims extending beyond those desires, okay? Often these aims, however, can only be achieved through EU-wide action and not action on a single state level. Because they seek to do things like reduce the amount of greenhouse gases emitted by the entire EU. But each individual country has its own national interests. Each individual country wants to burn its natural resources. And so you need somebody bigger, somebody stronger to make those decisions and make them enforced. Obviously, this is impossible if we don't have integration and an ability for the European Parliament to make real decisions. Those kind of step-ups in the EU's sovereignty, like the way it impedes on people's sovereignty, can only be possible through that further integration, through that furthering of the ceding of power to the European Parliament, okay? Like we also say, and that applies to lots of things, like the Europe 2020 plan, which seeks to reduce the impoverished in Europe, seeks to reduce the employed in Europe, and seeks to increase research. All of these things only possible with further integration. But secondly, in terms of economic aims, we say that monetary union is only possible insofar as fiscal union is possible, okay? We're stuck bailing out people when we can't look at the fact that Greece has cooked its books and Ireland is relentlessly increasing property inflation, okay? These things are impossible unless we have greater control over revenue streams, okay? It's like having to control your own debt while having no access to how much money you're getting and how you're spending that money. That's impossible. We say integration is needed to further those aims as well. For all of these reasons, because we just think that the EU needs more integration and the UK is opposed to that, we propose.
I would now like to call on the second speaker for the opposition, opposing the motion, James Risley.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Honourable Chair, ladies and gentlemen, the goal of the European Union was never to make a perfect union or a perfect federation. It was to do the best that we could with the context that we found ourselves in. Similarly, the goal of the UN wasn't to strive for heaven, but to save us from hell. I'm going to make the modest claim that the kind of fiscal union and the kind of federation that they want is too demanding. You're not going to get it. Because the characterization they give you is that David Cameron is subverting what is otherwise a fairly cohesive and aspirational and liberal European order. I point you to Hungary, I point you to Poland, I point you to Greece, I point you to Spain. The crucial point here, ladies and gentlemen, is not only that once you open Pandora's box, the nationalists in countries across Europe find it easier and more plausible to actually leave the European Union. Not only that you lose the UK as a kind of counterbalance that stops the federation and the fiscal union that they want, that is going to cause the European Union to disintegrate, but crucially as well, at a very basic level, politicians and decision makers don't operate the way that they want them to. Because what they told you, no thank you, was here is a sort of theoretic game that we have. There's a trade-off. We give them these particular things they can choose, and we're going to win. They're the intransigent child. That's not how nationalist politics works. That's not how politics works at the best of times. 3 issues in this speech. First of all, a bit more about decision-making. Secondly, about what each party can actually bring to the table. They told you that what the UK could bring was like nuclear exports. We want to talk about financial services, that kind of big banking sector that hasn't been talked about much in this debate. And finally, a bit more about cohesion, because we think it's central. Firstly, on decision-making. I want you to note at the outset that the way the first speaker of proposition framed this issue was we have certain interests and certain capacities, or the European Union does, and because I'm Australian, right, so all of your screw the English doesn't really apply to me because, and Alistair's Irish, so really you're just being really mean to Matt, which isn't that nice. And when David Cameron, being the omniscient, perfectly rational actor that he is, seems the kind of rational incentives that we contest, but suppose they're there for a moment, he will necessarily choose to bow to us because we can give him more. 2 things worth bearing in mind. The benefits they brought you were that rather than subverting the EU more and more, he would have to accept the moderate position and the moderate deal that we gave them. So that's the benefits they're arguing for, less subversion of integration. But what the cost is any instability that happens during that negotiation process, any kind of disagreement, any kind of macroeconomic chilling. Because even if after 5 years or 10 months of kind of negotiations and agreement, there is the watered-down free trade deal that they thought, even if that's the benefit that they get, and that the UK is now subverted to the EU, we would make the very modest suggestion that the harms are simply too great, and they would massively outweigh that. More about that to a moment. But crucially as well, because the decision-making process wasn't one in which David Cameron said, look, I agree, this is in the rational incentives for me to take part of it. We think it was one in which you were going to do things like lower capital controls on banks. It was one where you're going to try and make it such that your banking sector leach money from the EU. Because in the short term, if we accept it's a game where you're trying to fight off different incentives and different leverage, you're going to try and make the European Union hurt. As David Cameron, you're going to say, here are the things that we can do to you. Here is the way we can lower our banking sector. Here is the punishment we can cause you. And in the long run, that means we're going to win out in that free trade negotiation that you think is so important. What are those things? No, thank you. 6. First of all, it's worth bearing in mind the UK simply gives a huge amount of money to the EU, 10 billion a year. Even if that's in the short term, someone's going to fill that plug. Maybe that's Germany, maybe that's all of the countries across it. Note, even if that's filled, it generates huge resentment within the European Union, because people who have to fill that bill to make revenue deficits feel angry that they have to, can't spend money on domestic politics. Or alternatively, you suddenly have a massive decrease in the kinds of projects you're able to fund. We think that's a harm. But 2, and this was crucial as well, even if it's just soft power, it's relevant that in the short term this signals to the international community where the EU might be trying to make deals with places like Australia or China or America, that the EU doesn't have the UK there, and even if that's just uncertainty for a few years, that's a relevant harm as well. We thought crucially as well that regulatory divergence mattered in this debate, because the UK had the capacity to lower restrictions on its banking sector, to make it much more easy for people to access UK financial institutions. In the context of some tentative banking sectors across Europe, that was particularly troubling when you were able to sap investment and sap activity from places like France and places like Eastern Europe. We thought that was a harm. Crucially as well, we thought that timing was relevant, because if nothing else, we thought the kind of instability, the kind of uncertainty, if nothing else, that was occurring right now was particularly badly timed in the context of ongoing refugee crises that are going to continue and going to get worse. What does all of this mean? Because nothing I've told you were things that couldn't necessarily be overcome in the longer term. But they were the team that pitched this in a debate about the next 10 years. And all of the things I've told you were the kind of harms and kinds of uncertainties that would accrue after the referendum has been voted for and after there's been a yes. And what that means is that, firstly, there is genuine uncertainty about whether or not the EU would in fact have more bargaining power over the UK, but that even if it did, and even if there was going to be the deal which meant that the little child was put in its place, which is apparently the benefit we're talking about, there are so many harms to the EU, and those are massive. Because crucially, there were two things in this debate. There were the benefits to the EU, and maybe even if we accept their material, which I'll challenge in a moment, about less subversion, that is outweighed by the harms I've talked about now. But on that, we think they don't even get that harm. We think cohesion gets worse. They wanted to downplay the signalling function of a country leaving the EU. We didn't. We thought that there were nationalist parties across the EU that wanted to leave. But crucially, even if they didn't want to leave now, it only takes one cycle to start that process, right? It only takes one cycle of nationalism in Poland or a recently acceded EU country for it to mobilize people to say this is not working, other countries have left. That's the problem as well, because it only takes, if you do it rapidly, it could just be particular dissatisfaction at a particular point in time when the EU isn't working and you have more people leaving. So there is a genuine risk of a domino effect, especially if you have one or two people engaging in that process. If nothing else, the Pandora's box that you've opened now is the kind of EU in which you can leave and come back whenever you feel that it's not working for you. No thank you, because right now we have the genuine uncertainty about the legal frameworks. What they get is a situation in which you can have more stubborn children, more people saying this isn't working for us, we want to negotiate change. We think that's a particularly damaging thing that necessarily changes, no thank you, the union into a kind of like ongoing coalition of the willing that changes periodically. But crucially as well, we wanted to challenge the premise, no thank you, at the heart of their case, that the kind of federation they wanted was a good thing. We think maybe in an ideal world it would be. We don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world in which, if anything, the UK is an important counterbalance to the kinds of naive, optimistic unionism that isn't going to work and is going to encourage more countries to leave in the future. We would rather have an imperfect but closer union, no thank you, than either a federation of Ireland and France and Germany and no one else. That's something that we much prefer. We prefer the weaker union because the point wasn't a federation of a few, but the union of the many. We think you lose that. No thank you. But crucially as well, because looking back at the things I told you about the financial sector and looking back at the kinds of uncertain decision-making that you'd have, because recognize that it isn't a question of perfect rational decision-making, it's a question of behind the door deals and nationalism there. Even if it's only temporary uncertainty, even if it's only temporary uncertainty about whether or not there will be a deal managed, even if it's only temporary uncertainty whenever a country leaves in the future, that is sufficient to stop people putting money into the European project. Because if you're now one of the central powers, if you're Germany or you're France, and you see countries considering leaving left, right and centre, or a few years of uncertainty with the UK, whether it's going to join or not, even if that's only something which eventually leaves, you're not going to invest in the European project in the short term. And as long as that uncertainty continues being a problem, you aren't going to get that investment anymore, which means an unstable, less integrated, more fragmented union. Very proud to oppose.
I'd now like to call on the final competitive speaker for the proposition, the team captain, Lean Hunt.
Before I get going, I have in my hand here my passport. It is Irish. And I thought I would just kind of leave it on the podium there because this speech is going to include a lot of Brit bashing. And I thought that it might be, oh look, we'll put the Australian one next to it. And I thought that perhaps it might be relevant for you to sort of, envisage my harsh British tones sort of melding into a nice Irish lilt as I give out about the Brits. As you kind of look at the harp here, maybe you'll sort of be hypnotized or something. That's the plan anyway. So ladies and gentlemen, honourable adjudicators, the context of this debate is a Great Britain eminently unhappy with its current position in Europe. It is eminently unhappy with its current position in Europe and wishes to renegotiate that position. It considers itself special in Europe. Status quo of Great Britain as a member of the European Union that is not going to cause trouble will not continue, right? Sophie laid out very clearly the two scenarios which we are debating in this debate. On proposition, we would prefer the UK being allowed to impetuously leave the European Union, renegotiate its membership of the European Union from a much stronger bargaining platform where we have the leverage of our enormous economy now not open to the UK as it currently is. Or, on their side of the house, the UK aggressively renegotiating its position and managing to achieve damaging concessions from the European Union, which we actually think, despite their flippant responses, could be genuinely quite damaging. A couple of things in this speech. Firstly, some rebuttal from to all of the speakers, generally what we've heard. Secondly, what we think is likely to happen, why that is important, why our plausible scenario is important. Then political unity, then economic unity, why, on the metric that they themselves agree is the important one in this debate, we achieve better results on both. Some points of rebuttal. Firstly, on concessions, right? They want to dismiss David Cameron's concessions as generally not that big a deal, right? I will concede that his first two are vague and probably aren't going to be that big of a deal. His second two in his letter, dated 10th November, I have read it by the way, to Donald Tusk, are significantly worse. One particularly, which states that he would like an explicit recognition from the EU that Britain does not favour further European integration. When we give you then analysis as to why it is important that Britain stands in the way of the political unity of the European Union, that is not a nebulous point. That is a very direct concession which David Cameron wishes to extract from the European Union. Important context for the rest of my speech. Secondly, on contagion, right? They think that this is important and that lots of people are likely to want to leave if Britain does leave. A couple of things on this. Firstly, that argument is probably predicated on the assumption that the reason that currently those countries who apparently want to leave but have yet to not voice that want to leave for some strange reason are not leaving because the terms of Article 50 are unclear and they're just waiting for somebody else to do it first and then they'll know what the process is. Seems kind of unlikely to me that the only reason that everybody is staying in the EU is that they just don't know what will happen if they leave. Secondly, the threat of a Brexit has been around for a very long time and there is still an 8-person waiting list to join the European Union. Even during the global financial crisis, Croatia joined the European Union and that list got no shorter. No clear evidence in any sense that there is a declining interest in being a member of the European Union or that Britain leaving would destroy the Union. Unfortunately, we, they, whatever preposition you like, just aren't that important. Lastly, all of their examples are predicated on the assumption that those examples are analogous to Britain. Britain leaving would be unique insofar as it, unlike most of the other countries in the European Union, are not members of the Eurozone. It is not going to have to change its currency when it leaves. Most of those other countries that they're saying are Eurosceptic would have to change their currency. That is an enormous exit barrier. It makes it much less likely that those countries are going to want to leave if they have to spend years changing their currency and recirculating a new one. Britain can leave much easier than those people. The contagion doesn't happen. Lastly, they argue that Britain is holding together an already crumbling EU and that if we leave, the EU will be destroyed. Again, I would contend that Britain is not just that important, but the 11 billion contribution that they highlight is a gross contribution. If you add up the contribution, then take away the rebate, then take away all the money that Britain gets for agriculture and it gets for STEM, tech, whatever, R&D, it's actually about 4 billion. If you divide that by the 28 member states, 4 billion divided by 28, not an enormous number in a state's budget, probably easily coverable. When you also consider that state contributions in the context of a 13 trillion euro EU GDP, probably not that much of a problem in the short term. What is likely to happen? Sophie told you that in April 2015, 50% of Great Britain's exports went to the EU, and moreover that the sectors in which they were primarily exporting are sectors that are very, very difficult to relocate to other areas of the world. If Britain does leave and no longer has access to the trade that it currently does with EU countries, we would contend there is a significant amount of economic leverage that the EU has in our scenario where the UK leaves that it does not currently have, because the UK needs the EU more than the EU needs the UK. Sophie told you that FTAs are undesirable because the US is expressly against them. She told you the WTO is just not enough on its own. If the UK left the Eurozone and just relied on the WTO, it would have to start paying whacking 12% tariffs on all of its luxury car imports to the UK and to other places in the world. Probably something they want to avoid. Eminently plausible then in the first instance that we get a scenario that is like Norway, like Switzerland. They don't respond to that. Norway and Switzerland essentially just do all the things that a European member state do. Norway even pays a contribution, but they don't get any say in how EU policy is formulated. Because Switzerland, for example, understands that it has to just de facto ratify all the legislation the EU puts out because the exclusion from the single market is a very real threat to them. If that becomes a threat to the UK, we think we can bully them a bit more than we can now. We think that might actually be a good thing, given how belligerent they're being. So we actually think our best case scenario is them effectively still paying us money, still ratifying EU legislation, but not being the political thorn in our side. Political unity then. Cormac told you a lot on this, and we agree with them that the EU unity is valuable and that the EU is strong when it is unified. Why does Great Britain breed disunity? Cormac tells you that it is one of the key players in perpetuating the democratic deficit. How does it do that? It expects the EU, as do numerous other member states, of performing supranational functions. It expects the EU to do things like police monetary policy, and yet it refuses to cede the necessary sovereignty to the European Parliament for the European Parliament to be an effective democratic organ at determining that policy. That is where the democratic deficit originates, an unwillingness to cede sovereignty, but a desire for supranational governance. If the UK is removed, a significant block to that goes.
If we accept that closer integration is a good thing, why would the UK oppose the integration of the rest of the EU if, as David Cameron wants, it is given the opt-out it desires?
So the UK opposes integration because we have this nebulous and arrogant understanding of our own sovereignty as being more important than economics. We have, it is true, and I'll come on to this now, aggressively campaigned for economic liberalisation throughout the history of the European Union. We have spearheaded economic liberalisation because we have only ever seen the EU as a beneficial economic treaty. We have only ever seen it as a means to get the kind of economic liberalisation that we think is good for our financial centre, London. Economic policy and integration, this kind of further in response to the POI. Just there. Initially, on London, I mean, note that when London is no longer as the kind of the financial centre, you know, this is an enormous export that London has, that the UK has, the EU suddenly loses that. I mean, recognise still that the EU and EU economies are still going to be enormous customers for that financial centre. Those two bodies will continue to interact, as indeed will the UK and the EU generally. Like, it's not just a bargaining chip that the UK can leverage against the EU. Like, there will still be custom that financial services centre requires. Also note that places like Berlin and Frankfurt become eminently more attractive when London is no longer part of the largest free trade bloc in the world. London is a much less attractive prospect as a business, like beyond all the other kind of reasons of like, oh, they speak English, they're well educated, when they're no longer in Europe. Cormac gives you a number of reasons why economic policy, like why integration economically as well as politically could be a good thing. Like trying to police monetary policy without fiscal policy is mad. I mean, like it is, like he says, trying to manage personal debt without having any control over how much money you earn and no oversight over how it is spent. Like, it would be impossible for you as a person to do that. It is impossible for the EU as an institution to do that. Fiscal union would make us stronger on the world stage as well. Like, when we have to compete with super economies like North America, like growing economies like China and India. Even if you don't believe that integration is the way forward, we think it is probably worth trying. Currently, the UK stands as a barrier to both political and economic integration and to the kind of unity that they want. For all of those reasons, very, very happy to propose.
Mr. Speaker, it is very much true that the British people are... Also, yes, I'm the only British person. Enjoy. It is very much true that the British people want to renegotiate, or indeed to leave, possibly, the EU. But, like, punishing these people because of those wishes seems somewhat intellectually astounding to me, given the plethora of reasons that we've given you why this becomes worth both for the EU now and for the EU project going into the future. We've heard a lot of varying assertions about what the aims of the EU project should be. We challenge those to a degree, but also we say that even if those are the aims you want, then it becomes much harder to make a supernatural, cohesive state when you open the Pandora's box, as was literally the line from your own first speaker, and makes it suddenly seem plausible, makes it seem accessible, makes it seem viable that countries can leave the EU and can go it alone. We think that's especially likely in the case of the United Kingdom, given the reasons that we've already given you about why its economy is likely to be safe, secure, and even if it takes a hit, is not going to go completely kaput. So, two things in this speech. I want to talk about contagion and why we think that is probably the biggest, the most pressing worry of the EU given present times. And secondly, I want to talk about, just specifically about what some of the incentives or what some of the benefits that the UK itself does bring to the EU by just being in it. Before that, a couple of points on David Cameron's, incentives, because it is not just the case that there is this pure dichotomy between either we kick the UK out of the EU, or just say bye-bye and let it go, or we accept all of David Cameron's negotiations as in the letter. I mean, firstly, the letter was only published, a month ago, so this is early on in the negotiation process. But secondly, that's just how negotiations work. You obviously open with your highest offer. David Cameron is probably willing and quite happily to be talked down if it can be shown that is something that is in his interest. Also, David Cameron is not only beholden to rational incentives of UK and EU public policy. A large part of him going in with the highball offer is simply just posturing so he can show the UK public that he is standing up for UK and standing up for British interests and all that rubbish. It's just not true that he is a perfect rational actor. And given that, we say it's especially more likely that he is likely to do things like deregulate London's financial markets, something the EU have been very much against, because it will be showing him fighting and standing up for UK's interests in the face of this. They tell us that, if the UK leaves, we'll just end up being like Norway and we'll just accede to all the EU legislation, but we won't be able to change it. That seems implausible, given that the main reason the UK wants to leave the EU is because they don't want to accede to much of the legislation that is being put forward. We also just say that the differences are really important, namely things like the financial services industry, which Norway does not have one of. Also, Norway is not just beholden to the EU. It has the largest sovereign wealth fund of any country in the world and is pretty much fine and could leave the EU if it's so decided, or leave its cooperation with it. So, two things. Firstly, contagion, right? Because from PM we're told that, the EU obviously has more leverage than the UK in a kind of negotiating some kind of settlement if these two actors separate. Well, that is true, right? But what you assume is the EU will remain a cohesive state that will be able to negotiate and will be able to bring ideas to the table as one single voice that will remain in unity from this time immemorial. We suggest that's actually increasingly unlikely. Why? Because we've already seen huge numbers of countries and parties in those countries rallying against the idea of an EU superstate, right? We've seen, the possibility of a Brexit last year. We saw similar problems with Ireland and Portugal in 2008, 2009, but precisely one of the biggest reasons why this didn't happen was because no one knew whether it would be viable, whether you'd be throwing your entire economy down the drain by leaving the EU. When it happens, and when it is shown to happen and be successful, we say that people are more likely to do so, or even just entertain the thought that that might be something that they could do, to take that seriously. That alone is a massive harm. We say it's in the EU's interest to keep Pandora's box closed permanently. They say, look, their response to this is, look, other countries want to join. It's really unclear to us why just letting Turkey into the EU, which is probably a whole other debate as to that's something that's particularly good, will necessarily plug the hole of the UK leaving, and we don't think that's particularly sufficient. The other countries that may want to join the EU probably just don't come to the same, amount of utility as the UK does in itself, because it's just a massively larger country, it's a massively larger economy, etc. So, why is it especially important to consider contagion now? A couple of reasons that are brought you down those fits. Firstly, just as Alistair says, right, the UK has, removing the UK unbalances one of the key, political trade-offs and deadlocks that we have in the EU at the moment, between the largely protectionist bloc headed by France and the other more free trade-oriented states. Once the UK leaves and the protectionist bloc has all the power, it now makes it much more likely that states that are more traditionally aligned to the economic right are going to want to do things like consider leaving the EU. Given that no notice also that these are the countries that already have the biggest problems, like with Euroscepticism, right? So you're just re-empowering that rhetoric. Secondly, we just say the rise of the European right is a huge problem, right? He tells us that UKIP is on the rise. Well, UKIP is on the rise, but so is the Golden Dawn. Well, it was. So is the Front National, right? The point is that we're seeing right-wing anti-European project parties springing up across Europe, right? And when they're not seen as crackpots, but people who say, well, maybe their idea actually will work because it worked in the UK, people and voters are going to be more persuaded by this rhetoric, given that it already just tallies into lots of things that people point. Ultimately, the decision about whether a country leaves or stays in the EU is not made on some kind of series of economic spreadsheets and you decide whether it's the best or the worst thing to happen to your country. It's made by individual people when they go to the polls and when they vote. And these people aren't always perfect, rational economic actors, much as it disappoints economists to say so, but it is broadly just true. So, does the UK have a feeling of exceptionalism? Not really. Every country has a feeling of exceptionalism. Every country has a feeling that its country and its own sovereign national interest should always take primacy. This is why, for example, Ireland voted against the Treaty of Lisbon being imposed. So it's just unclear that the UK is, this sole actor who does have this sense of exceptionalism. Maybe it's particularly, profound and patriotic given its history, but it's not the case that Romania just sees itself as part of an EU superstate and doesn't want its own national identity and isn't already swinging to the right and considering leaving. Next, things like the refugee crisis. Austria has closed its borders. Hungary is literally building fences, right? The European project has never been under greater strain than it is now. Problems with this is, as I said, I'll take you in 1 second, it already empowers the right-wing rhetoric. But also, when we see other crises, like what happened in Paris a few weeks ago, when France is closing its borders and imposing border checks, we already see increases in the Front National and opinion polls. People are starting to wonder, are starting to conflate the idea of a European superstate on purely economic terms with other things that they care about, like their own political autonomy, with their own security. And this pushes voters to the right, and it pushes voters away from supporting a European superstate. So it's just incredibly important at this critical juncture in time that we don't allow the seed to be planted in people's minds that you can leave the EU and everything can be fine. Go.
Okay, then how does it help if we make concessions on limiting immigration? How does that help the immigration refugee crisis if you concede to Cameron's demands?
No. My argument is not that the UK leaving has some impingement on how we deal with the refugees per se. What I'm saying is that there are millions of people across the EU who look at the refugee crisis and say, this is a reason that we should not be in Europe. When they see that the UK is able to leave, then those people, when they go to the polls in France, when they go to the polls in Romania and Poland, are going to vote to the right, and they are going to be very much against greater integration, which is what you hang your hat on as something that's being good. So UK's importance to the EU, second reason why we've won this debate. It's really unclear to us why more integration is necessarily a good thing. Importantly, the UK is a nuclear power. It's a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. It's one of the largest economic powers in the world and one of the largest military powers in the world. Uniquely, it is able to act as a counterbalance to France and Germany. It's just unclear to us when they give us this characterization of Jean-Claude Juncker sitting in his cave scheming that this is something the Brits believe. It's not clear to us why he's necessarily right. Okay, Ireland, maybe we're not expecting you from history to stand up to the Germans, but possibly it's something that some people probably should. Sorry, James said I had to make at least one joke. So, next, the UK just is a net contributor to the EU, right? Liam tries to put this down and say, oh no, you take into account all these other things. No, Liam, that's what net contributor means. It means net. When we take, all of the contributions, all of the deficits, blah, 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 the UK puts in £10 billion, 10 billion euros, whatever, to the EU. Importantly, he tells us, it's not that much, even if he rubbishes it down to 4 billion. The point is, firstly, that just is quite a lot of money. But secondly, it's a lot of money, or it can be made to seem like a lot of money to the voters in various countries that are already considering leaving the EU. The UK is a key mediator between the United States. Yes, the US is going to say, oh no, we don't want a bilateral trade deal, because they're trying to persuade the UK to stay in the EU. But once that leaves, it's perfectly conceivable that the UK might just become party to TPP, etc. It's very easy for David Cameron to massively screw up the financial services industry of Europe by deregulating London. It's something he's likely to do. Ultimately, we want the European project to be a success. It can only be a success when people believe that it is the way forward, and that doesn't happen when the UK leaves. For those reasons, we oppose.
I would now like to ask the adjudicating panel to retire to consider their votes.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's always an honour and a privilege to address the College Historical Society. In 2011, Nigel Farage addressed the European Parliament, and in it he said something very interesting. He said that the British exit is a bit like the Great Escape. And that made me ask myself, is that really how British politicians view this, as just a great escape? When William Hague is asleep in bed at night, does he think of David Cameron stuck in one of these Eurosceptic internment camps, attempting to escape by bumbling through the spotlights, presumably from Claude Juncker's German towers, as it tells us, while at the same time trying to hop over a fence of all the regulations the EU has? And then, perhaps when he's done that, he would jump over a pool of toxic debt, he would go on dodging Eurocoin bullets coming from the rifle of Jose Manuel Barroso, and maybe, when he eventually crawls through the Channel Tunnel, he will declare that Britain is free at last. But ladies and gentlemen, back in the real world, life goes on. The reality situation is there is no magic wand that says that when Britain leaves, that our lives are fundamentally transformed. Because the economy still functions, the euro still circulates, governments still rule. Because the reality situation is that Britain may well be technically still a member of the European Union, but in spirit they've been gone for over 20 years now. It's not about whether or not we're going to get rid of Britain's economic presence in the Union, but rather is about whether we want to continue carrying a passenger who no longer wants to be in the vehicle. There's one point I want to develop within this, ladies and gentlemen, and that is the whole idea of dissent, and Britain's role in dissent in actively blocking policies, and how that's going to be very harmful for the EU's ability to compete internationally. Because I accept that Britain's dissent in policies, the kind of opposition to EU policies we see a lot, is not in and of itself a bad thing. I mean, gadflies can be something very good, as Athens found out in ancient times. But there's a difference between prodding and poking at policies to make them more efficient and trying to shut those policies down in the first place. Britain has consistently tried to get in the way of policies that increase immigration, that increase the free movement between countries, and which set rules for industries which make those industries more in line with each other. And the reason this is important, ladies and gentlemen, is that what we're competing against internationally are essentially integrated markets. China and USA are integrated markets, though they all operate on the same page. And that's what we're going to see when India and Brazil become bigger in the decades to come. What Britain's constant Euroscepticism stands for is a Europe which is not composed of one single market, but rather a Europe which is composed upon many smaller markets, each competing against each other. That's the end product of the kind of national sovereignty which they seem to be so invested in. Because the whole idea behind freedom of movement is not just for the fun of it. It's because, I'll take Stephen in a moment, it's because we in Europe genuinely believe that Europe performs much better and much stronger when there aren't barriers to people being able to move to the place where their work is able to go. Time for one very quickly.
If your case is that we should have separate markets within Europe, why do you want Britain to leave creating more separate markets?
For the very simple reason that it's Britain's opposition to policies which make it more difficult for the EU market to function efficiently. Because we can look at things such as corporation tax, something which has been debated many times in this country, and look at that as the kind of thing which Britain tends to block, and countries like Britain as well. But it's having consolidated corporation tax around Europe that prevents countries such as Ireland, yes, I know I said it, trying to cheat countries such as France and Germany taxes higher. It prevents countries from trying to outdo other countries' economies, better deals for themselves. It's because the reality it's not just that. It's essentially, that's the idea Britain stands for. It's an insular, inward-looking, what's the best for my country, but not what's the best for my union. And as long as they remain in the European Union, that's what they'll do. They'll block the kind of policies that'll make it more likely that the Europe is able to compete economically internationally. For that reason, I'm very happy to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, a wise and influential British thinker once said that if anything is worth having, it's sure enough worth fighting for. I am referring to Cheryl Cole, but I promise you that there is a speech in here somewhere, okay? We think that the European Union is one of the most important things that we have in the modern world, not only in terms of like economic sense, but in terms of just the influence that we have on like international policy, on human rights, on, you know, making the world a more peaceful and better place, right? We think that having Britain within this is important for several reasons, okay? So I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about human rights, and I'm going to talk about, well, the heading is Britain aren't all that bad, which is surprising from me, but sure. I am joking. But yeah, so let's talk about human rights, right? We think that human rights are probably the single most like important thing that we get from the European Union. We know that there is a European European Treaty on Human Rights. We note that there are like huge human rights protections inherent in that union. We think Britain leaving, right, is tragic for Britain because of the fact that they throw away those protections for British people. But we think it's more importantly tragic for everyone else within Europe because of the fact that when there is a precedent for one nation to decide they don't want those protections, there is a precedent for other nations to launch against those, okay? We note that in the modern world, we have the single most volatile environment that we can imagine in terms of Syria, in terms of, you know, other international crises. We note that in this circumstance, one of the things that is being like most commonly talked about as something that that needs to be eroded are the rights of refugees to claim refuge. We think that goes away when Britain leave from so many other countries. We note that countries like Hungary are blocking their borders already, are trying to get rid of the few rights that refugees have, the few rights that anyone trying to make a happy life for themselves within those countries have. We think that when you get rid of a European general treaty on human rights, general laws, that's worse. And we think that countries that don't support those, right, can just leave the European Union and will just leave the European Union when it suits them, particularly noting the fact that in so many countries, like France, like Italy, there are huge movements against freedoms, against human rights, like Front National, who are, frankly, a racist party, okay? Moreover, we think that when you have, Adriano, I will take anyone that's not him, okay? Right? Moreover, we think that when Britain exit, they set a precedent for people to start ignoring these rights, start ignoring these things. Because when you kick up a fuss, when you start trying to change the laws and undermine the laws of Europe, you damn it, right? You get your way, and he's not him, go.
If people leave because they don't want to have these human rights, then I don't think we want them in our union.
Right. I don't think that it's legit to decide that, we don't want X country within the European Union because they don't care about rights, noting that the people in that country then don't have rights. Hence, I just don't understand what he said, okay? Okay. Right, secondly, we note that Britain brings huge benefits to the European Union, right? Even if we have to bring them along kicking and screaming, which we do, we think we get a huge amount of academic expertise and a wealth of educational and cultural opportunities. We note that two of the best universities in Europe, Oxford and Cambridge, who are almost as good at debating as us, right? Give us a huge amount of help. We note that the LSE, UCL, blah, 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 I'm thinking of more institutions to fill time, right? Those places give us a huge amount of knowledge on how to create a more peaceful world. We note that organizations like Stonewall, organizations like Amnesty have huge UK organizational bases, base themselves often in the UK because they are a country that brings us these benefits, these rights, and we're very happy to say we want them to stay.
Ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, I am very happy to be able to stand up here and once more say, Brits out, please. So, most of the points that have already come up have, covered most of the things that I wanted to say. We're quite late in the debate. So what I'm going to do is begin by saying that I'm not an economics student, but I want to paint a picture for you of a Europe that stretches from Britain to the Mediterranean, from Spain up to modern Germany. A Europe who decide, they're finding it very difficult to hold together, that different regions have different desires, that different regions want to do different things, and so they decide to decentralize and they divide. They proceed to collapse, and the Roman Empire fell, and the last time that Europe was as united as we are at the moment, they took the wrong decision and they decided that they could take different roads. Europe must be united, and that is my first point, European unity. We've repeatedly heard through this debate about an ever greater union. And we have heard from this side that a two-tier union is a possibility. We say it is not, because the fundamental core of an ever greater union is that we do one day reach a federated states of Europe. And in order to do so, you cannot have a state like Europe, which fundamentally, or not Europe, like the UK, which fundamentally does not want to be in the EU. It does not want to be in a federated states of Europe. The reality is, British politics is far more Eurosceptic than Europe as a whole. Look at the fact that the majority of their MEPs are from UKIP. Look at the fact that the Tories don't sit with the majority centre-right party. They've decided that they're not good enough for them. They're going to go off with their own little centre-right party, who also happen to be Eurosceptic and kind of racist at the same time. We can see right across the board that Britain's views simply aren't in line with Europe's views. The British values are not in line with European values, the kinds of European values that must be at the heart of the European project and must be at the heart of any federated states of Europe. We've heard again and again about human rights and about the fact that one of David Cameron's policies upon which he was elected to a majority government was scrapping the European Human Rights Act and bringing in a British Bill of Rights, essentially a watered-down, worse version of what they've had. David Cameron was originally elected in the first time, saying that he was going to reduce net migration to Britain down to 100,000 a year. He failed to do so. But again, this points to the fact that Britain as a whole, the political consensus, is against immigration, is against the free movement of people, something which Angela Merkel has said is one of the core pillars of Europe. Again and again, we see that British values do not chime in time with European values. The fact that even polls that have repeatedly come out have shown that British people, on average, do not identify nearly as much as any other state in Europe as being European. You go to France, Germany, Ireland, and people regard themselves, yes, often as being German, French, or Irish first, but then European. Britain is not the same. And this, again and again, is going to cause problems if we try to move towards an ever greater Europe. And we've heard many things about contagion, about the fact that other states might choose to leave. That simply isn't going to happen. Other states aren't Britain. They don't have Britain's same history. They also don't have, and it's true, the economic power to be able to leave. Because small Eurosceptic states, as strong as that opinion may be, aren't, like, it would be economic suicide for them to leave. I'm going to finish with a quote from Oscar Wilde, because we were told that the idea of an ever greater union, of a European federation, is naive, that it is silly. What I say is we are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. And I thought I could deliver that a bit more seriously. But no, I do think it's true that even if it is naive, no great political achievement has been made without reaching for the stars, without saying that we're going to try and do something that is beyond what seems possible. And if Britain is what's holding us back, then it is better for us that Britain goes. So I finish by saying, Brits out and better for all of us. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the strength of the EU does not solely come from like the single market that it provides to its member states. It also comes from its ability to compete on an international level with countries such as the USA, and it allows its member states to compete with those larger countries in a way that they would not otherwise be able to do so. That's what I want to talk about in this speech today. I want to talk sort of firstly about like trade policy on a sort of interlevel between the EU and other countries, and then secondly I want to talk about the EU's international influence. Now, like Oisin, I'm not actually an economics student, even though if in debates I sometimes like to pretend I am. My girlfriend is, though, but unfortunately she wouldn't help me with this speech, so maybe some of this economics that I'm talking is a bit off. I don't know. Let's hope it's all good. Certainly not as good as our two teams here today. So first point then, a bit about like sort of trade policy. So the EU like currently has like two top trade priorities at the moment. One with USA and one with Japan. The one with USA is of course the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. The second one is the Economic Partnership Agreement with Japan. Like these are both like really important trade deals like for the EU if it wants to compete on that international level, like which I think is like a pretty good thing that it can do. The problem here, though, is that Japan and US are both currently involved in their own trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, and like because of a number of reasons, four to be precise, they're not going to want to deal with the EU in the same way if Britain leaves. So why is this? Like first off, because like now the GDP of the EU is reduced, as we've already heard in the debate, because Britain has left. We have less money. That makes us less attractive to strike trade deals with because we have like less money to spend on things. That's pretty obvious, I think. The second reason then is that the UK is actually the country that has like most championed these trade deals to actually with the US and Japan. So if the US and Japan now see the UK leaving, the main champion of these deals, they're going to be less willing to buy into those agreements because they see like the main supporter of them having left the EU. They no longer see the EU as willing to engage in those deals. The third reason is the political contagion that has already been outlined on opposition, and I'm going to do like outline a bit more. No thanks, Jamie. Now, because there is a rise of Euroscepticism like within the EU, and like we've heard on proposition like repeatedly, like even in Oisin's speech, that like the UK is like an individual. It is solely different because people there do not define themselves as European in a way that like people in other member states do. Like the problem is like the motivations for those member states wanting to leave the EU might be different to the motivations that Britain has. So, for example, like what's happened in Greece and a number of other smaller countries, where they're essentially screwed over to some extent by larger countries such as Germany, who refuse to remove like any sort of to wipe any sort of debt. Those sort of motivations would lead those countries to want to leave the EU. If they see Britain leaving, they're more likely to want to leave, even if Britain has left for different motivations, for different reasons. Okay, and the last reason then that these trade deals are as likely to work is that the UK is quite likely to undercut the EU, like on things like its financial services sector, in terms of just like regulation. Generally, it is quite likely to try and undercut the EU, both to attract like companies to come and foreign direct investment in that way, and also on a countrywide scale on trade agreements with countries. The problem is not just that, but now what you're left with in the EU is, as has been pointed out on-side opposition already, is that you lose the liberal voting bloc that can form a blocking minority when it comes to agreeing to these sort of trade deals within the EU. The countries such as like Netherlands, Ireland, the Nordic countries, and Germany no longer make up that minority that can block the sort of protectionist ideals of the other countries. What that means is those other countries are quite likely to set sort of protectionist tariffs and protectionist trade agreements that block out deals such as TTIP and the EAP. For all those reasons, I beg you to oppose. Thank you.
away from this 800 years, it is even less effective when 4 of the speakers are Irish, 1 is Australian, and only 1 is British. Even our floor speakers were doing it. So can we please decommission the Brits out language? Are we in favour of that? Yes. And while we're at it, then our British friend did respond by trying to get us on the old "you were neutral" during the Second World War. And all I have to say, though, sir, is for shame, too soon. My second disappointment is that in a debate where we had a truly interdisciplinary set of speakers, our speakers did not take full advantage of their interdisciplinarity. For example, we had one gentleman who was single-arms history, lean history and politics. Lean could go both short or long-term in his vision. We had a few who were doing politics, only one doing economics. Luckily, no one made the mistake of our beloved record secretary in admitting, look, I don't know any economics, this might be all right, but it might be a bit off. The advice I would give you as students is, if you're going to get an essay back, always go in hard, go in bluffing. Don't go in as you're about to get the essay back and say, look, I'm sorry, that was rubbish. I didn't put much time in, I was kind of drunk. Because the person is probably marking it out. Well, I gave it a first. I was probably drunk. Well, never say, look, this essay might have been alright, it might have been a bit off. No, just going on. But no, my problem with the lack of interdisciplinarity is we had Cormac, neuroscience. We had Matt, veterinary medicine. But did they use it? Like, think how much better the debate would have been if Cormac had said, see, look, I do a lot of this theoretical frameworks. The British brain is actually wired differently. And put it up to the other side. And then Matt would have responded with, but think of the animals. And he would have really got us because we don't study veterinary medicine in Trinity. And we would have been, oh God, I wonder, is that true? And it really could have elevated the debate to a much higher and grander level. So could I please urge you next year, make the most of your interdisciplinarity. My third disappointment has to do with the order paper. Now, I'm a big enough man that when I'm described as history star, I wouldn't mind that you've also spelt my name wrong. In fairness, it's a difficult name. It makes me think you don't really believe I'm a radio star. But anyway, I'm big enough for that. The second mistake, though, is you get one of the speakers' names wrong. No. But the worst, the most egregious error. It has taken you as a society so many years to get this competition back. And then you go and spoil it all by writing something stupid like E or S-I. It is, of course, the E-S or I. Now, I have to admit that when I met Francis Rowan for dinner last year, I said, and of course I will introduce you as director of the E-or-S-I, and she corrected me, so that even when our auditor was announcing it, I froze and I thought, well, maybe that is right. So I can understand how these errors can happen. But of course, our distinguished chair of the adjudication panel is Professor Francis Rowan. She was an absolutely phenomenal director of the ESRI from 2006 to July of this year, and she is now a research associate with them. She's an honorary fellow of this university, and I think we've been truly honoured to have her as our. But I have to say, I also have a question about if you can all go to page 3. I'm a little bit confused by the description of a poor speech. Because the final line for a poor speech description is, could be worse, but could be much better. No, but if you go one level up, and the brains and the heart of the Student Economic Review debate for so many years, Professor John O'Hagan. He looked at us, and he looked at me, and he looked at her, and he looked at me, and then he looked back to her and he said, "You know, you don't really have to do it." An awkward dart ride ensued. But I have to say, John O'Hagan is an absolutely brilliant figure, and I think these debates every year are absolutely, I think for me, one of the highlights of the academic year. And I think no matter who wins tonight, whether it's Trinity or whether it's Cambridge, I think we had a brilliant array of arguments. There was a packed theatre, which I think is always brilliant to see. So I think congratulations to everyone who's involved in the organisation tonight.
Stand here if that's okay. The bit I always miss is the bit that happens when we're out of the room, so that's the one of the cost of being an adjudicator. And coming in after this particular chairman, you know, they always say don't appear on the stage, is it with a small child or a little puppy dog? Don't speak straight after Patrick because you have to sound incredibly dull. In defence of the people whose spelling is limited and 4 letters are too many to get in an unscrambled way, could I say that, I mean, I do have a certain feeling because, of course, it rhymes with PRSI, which we all pay at some stage in our career, pay-related social insurance, but it is not the economic-related social insurance body. So anyway, as I say, it happens to the national broadcaster as well as everybody else, so you're in quite good company, those of you who are having difficulty with 4-letter words. And it's, as 4-letter words go, it's a safer one to get wrong than some others. This was a really great topic, great debate, and I think the way the proposition had to be done by Trinity, which in a sense was the harder proposition really to make, a harder side to be on, but in the context of the discussion that's going on in Ireland at the moment, I think that it was great that it happened that way. We all were very impressed by the amount of content that all the speeches had. There was fantastic content, and I think that was really good. We also felt that a little bit, I guess, at times, content might have got in the way of sort of persuading the audience about what was happening. I was kind of watching you guys as well as watching them, the speaker. I was watching how people were taking it in. And I think it's, you know, when it's a competitive debate like this, it's important to realise that you're also in a chamber. So it's also people out there. So speaking out to the people who are there, speaking to that is actually really very important. As I say, the content was really good. I think a lot. I couldn't think of any major issues that weren't hit on at different stages by the different speakers. And it was a relief to finally hear a UK voice in the last speaker. I was really getting very concerned that everybody had left and turned off the lights and left Mr. Cameron behind. So it was as I said, that was terrific. Now, in terms of some of the memorable moments, in some sense, the proposition came up with the reference to Pandora's box, which was probably not the best idea in the context that the opposition were able to take it and run with it. Now, I think it was, you had the issue of saying that it was Britain going in, Britain going out in the Pandora's box. And of course you missed the good line that it was really Jack in the Box that was in at that particular point. There was also another very, very good line, I think, in the final speech, which really was rather good. But I love the idea that Britain is not exceptionally exceptional. And I think that's sort of an interesting way, likening to us being exceptional in our own particular way, that was rather good. So it was very tight. We debated long and hard upstairs. We got through quite a number of grapes. Some people actually got a piece of brie as they were sitting there to vouch them. But we came to the conclusion that by a tight margin, the winners this year are Cambridge. Just don't get carried away with yourselves. What you get is you get the name on this. You do not get to take it back on the boat or the Ryanair flight or any other place that you might be thinking of going, but it is going to have your names on it in years to come, and it's wonderful that you've been here today, and thank you for coming. Which I think is something which it takes time out of the term to kind of come over and make this venture, and I think it's a terrific one. In terms of the other thing we have to do is to get the speaker of the evening, and we were all unanimous that the speaker of the evening was Liam. For Liam is that he doesn't get to look at this just at this, he actually gets a medal to take. Here you go. Now. So, as a final word, to those of you in the room who are economists and maybe have an exam paper to do for John O'Hagan or other people in this room later on in the year on topics to do with Brexit or others, because goodness knows where I get that to turn up in a lot of exam papers, and I hope it'll be spelled properly because that could be confusing. The sort of messages from this evening really were about that notion of what Brexit means for more integration, less integration, what it means for contagion, and I think there were arguments really very good arguments put by everyone on that side. So those of you who are putting the exam papers, put that into them. Exceptionalism I've mentioned already, but I think one of the interesting ones from an Irish point of view was I think it's an argument of a discussion, is that notion of whether or not the UK and its role in Europe is as a reformer or is as a stander in the way of progress. And that really is a huge argument. In fact, we don't know the answer to that. But we do know that from an Irish perspective, there has been a very strong link joined between some of the reforms that have taken place in Europe and the UK's role in putting them forward. So could I, as chairman, thank my team members. We as we debated long and hard, we are still talking to each other. You can watch the body language afterwards. We basically talked it through, and just want to congratulate the 6 speakers this evening, and Cambridge for winning, Liam for winning the special prize, and thank all of you for coming. Thank you.
General Manager of the Student Economic Review. While I have you all here, I'm going to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we're about. I suppose the main thing is that each year we publish an academic journal comprised of essays on economics written by the students here at Trinity College. And I just love to encourage all of you to submit an essay for publication. It's an amazing opportunity to demonstrate your skills and your knowledge of economics in a way that's so much more exciting and so much more impressive than just by sitting your compulsory exams. So the deadline is the 19th of February, and if any of you guys want any more information or help with that, you can check out our website. We should have a little thing coming up soon that will give you a little bit of hints or tips or things that we'll be looking for in the essays that we'll actually choose to go into our booklet. But apart from that, we also have a few more events coming up. In February, we're going to have another debate against Harvard, and we're also going to help out the Trinity Economic Forum with their workshops. So that's going to be very exciting. It's actually a particularly good year to get involved with us, as it's our 30th anniversary. And with that in mind, I'd like to thank, for the success of tonight's debate, not only this year's committee, who are all fantastic and capable and lovely people, but also all the previous committees and the heads of the economics department, and all the members of the economics department who have guided them along the way, because really if they hadn't set such a high standard for all these events and for the review in general, then we wouldn't be able to have an event as nice as this has been. We wouldn't be able to convince people like Patrick Gagan and like Francis Duran to come and help us out. And by the way, we'd like to thank the both of you for making this debate so lively and so fair. And we wouldn't be able to attract speakers of the calibre that we saw today, so thanks a million to Cambridge, and congratulations for coming. You guys were amazing, and thanks for coming all this way. And thank you so much to the Trinity speakers, and thanks to all the people in the economics department who so wisely chose them, because they were absolutely fantastic. Lastly, it's usually the debates manager of the SUR who thanks the correspondence secretary of the HIST, but actually Annabelle occupies both of those roles. And she's way too modest to thank herself. So I'd like to say a big thanks to the HIST in general, and to Annabelle specifically, because she was a really driving force. But yeah, it was a fantastic evening. Hope you guys all enjoyed yourselves. The rest of the night should be equally as good, and we hope to be part of many more of these occasions to come. So cheers.
And finally, I would like to call upon Annabelle, who is the debates manager of the SCR and the correspondence secretary of the HIST, to close things off.
Thanks everyone for what was an absolutely amazing night. I won't keep you too long because we've an absolutely great reception for you upstairs, and I hope you will all join us for that upstairs. So yeah, firstly I want to thank the Student Economic Review. We have just met some of the most lovely people this year. This year it's funny, we have 8 people on committee, 7 girls, 1 guy, compared to last year, which was the exact inverse of 7 guys, 1 girl. So I'm really happy about that, and I'm really excited to keep getting to know those people, and they've been really helpful in supporting me, and especially Kate for supporting me in this event. Other people I wanted to thank are, of course, lecturers. They came along, they helped us do the trials, they helped prep the team, and of course John, who is my favourite person. I constantly emailed him late at night, it might be midnight. I'm like, John, what about this tiny thing? He's like, it's okay, Annabelle, it's fine, it'll be fine. And then moving on to the judges, thank you so much. Thanks for Ursula and Will and everyone here on coming back to the HIST after many years of, Will's always around. I thought Will hadn't graduated, but he has, but he's still involved. He did a debate a few weeks ago as well, so, that's great. And then also on top of that, I want to thank our chairs, especially Francis was here with us a few weeks ago, and Patrick always helps us out with the debate. And I like to think that, our oratory turns are kind of a special thing in the HIST. They're not always spelled correct. And, that's something memorable, isn't it? in our Freshies Week, we had the really fun, cool, new, interesting debate. This house would free the nipple with 3 P's just to emphasise the word nipple. And then of course I want to thank the teams. Thank you guys for so much. Thanks for trialing, especially Cambridge. You guys were really fun. We were all at dinner together earlier, and they told us about all the secret societies in Cambridge. And it was the most Cambridge thing you could ever have thought of. It was great. And then finally, I just want to thank my committee. You guys are a huge support to me, my HIST committee, because I mean, 2 committees, but my HIST committee in particular. You're all really supportive. You put on this great event. We put in so much work into these events, and we really appreciate you guys for all coming here tonight. And in particular, I wanted to thank my deputies, Paul, Rihanna, and Grace. You give me so much support all the time, and you've been a huge help with this, so thank you so much. Okay. And then just quickly, quickly for our upcoming events, next week we have our debate, This House Supports Hillary 2016. We have some cool guests coming in, including Marion Finucane will be chairing the debate. And then leading up to that, we're going to be running, and that event is, we're doing that with Politics Talk. Leading up to that, we're going to have a workshop on the Monday on the American presidential race 2016, just in general. So if you have questions about that, we have 5 experts coming in on that day, so you should come in and check that out. This weekend, of course, we're doing the Cork IB. It's going to be loads of fun. You'll hear more about it in our minutes next week, so definitely come to the debate just for them. And I also want to congratulate everyone who has made it to the semi-finals of our Maidens competition. Our Maidens final will be happening the following week after the Hillary debate, so definitely check that out. We're hugely thankful for all the maidens who have done our competition, and we're really happy for you guys to have gotten involved. And yeah, come up to our reception now. That is everything.
Congratulations again to Cambridge. The House is adjourned.
Thank you very much. Isn't necessarily correct because it has been
James, we want a trophy. Don't actually see it. You usually get 2 trophies.
Yes, well, I know.
When we had this show back, we were doing it. One that was one. Oh, yeah. So they used to be in the chamber, the press office. They used to just be in the pub. There was like, I'm not sure what it was. It was like, it was the UCD something. And it had just been.
No, I'm not leaving you, I'm just
for
stopping
years and years and years.